The planet was a deep blue world, circled by two moons that hung in the sky like watchful eyes. Its endless forests stretched across continents, broken by jagged mountains and icy seas. For centuries, the planet had thrived undisturbed, its ecosystems perfectly balanced. At the top of that hierarchy stood the valtheron, a predator so elusive and dangerous that most species on the planet had never seen it. Even the bravest animals gave it a wide berth, their instincts honed over millennia. That was until the Othari came. The Othari were a militaristic alien race, expanding their empire across the galaxy. Their soldiers were tall, armored, and disciplined. They saw planets like this one not as living ecosystems but as resources to be harvested. The Othari considered themselves apex hunters, their advanced technology allowing them to dominate any environment. When they landed, the balance of the planet shifted. They brought metal ships that hovered above the ground, leaving burning scars in their wake. They hunted the native species not for food, but for sport, or simply to assert dominance. It wasn't long before they began hearing rumors about the valtheron. The Othari warlords saw the predator as a trophy, something they could add to their conquests. And so they began their hunt. But the valtheron wasn't an easy target. It was massive, easily 3 times the size of any Othari soldier and covered in sleek, black fur that blended seamlessly into the shadows of the forest. Its eyes were bright silver, with intelligence gleaming behind them, and its limbs were thick with muscle, powerful enough to tear through metal if it wished. It moved like a phantom through the trees, always one step ahead of the Othari hunting parties. Yet the Othari did not give up. They laid traps, set up ambushes, and even used bait to draw the creature out, and eventually their persistence paid off. The valtheron was injured. The trap had been a particularly vicious one, an energy net designed to entangle and weaken its prey. It had wrapped around the creature's massive body, the energy pulses burning through its skin and leaving deep gashes. Even in pain, the valtheron had fought back, killing 3 Othari soldiers before finally escaping. But it hadn't escaped unscathed. The beast was limping, bleeding, its once mighty strength sapped. The Othari celebrated, confident that they had finally crippled the planet's apex predator. They would find it soon enough, finish the job, and display its head as a symbol of their superiority. Not far from where the injured valtheron limped through the dense forest, a human named Calla was tracking the same predator. She wasn't a soldier, nor was she a native to this world. In fact, she was one of the few humans who had managed to survive the Othari occupation, staying hidden in the forests and mountains for the past 2 years. The Othari didn't think much of humans. To them, the frail, soft-skinned species was an annoyance at best, barely worth the trouble of exterminating. But Calla had learned to use their underestimation of her to her advantage. While the Othari searched for their glory in open battles, Calla had mastered the art of stealth, learning the ways of the wild and becoming one with the planet's rhythms. And now, as she tracked the valtheron, her heart was heavy. She had seen the signs: the torn-up foliage, the blood on the ground, the broken branches. The predator was wounded. The thought of the Othari capturing and killing such a magnificent creature filled her with rage. They had already destroyed so much of the planet, polluting its rivers and burning its forests in their endless hunger for control. To let them kill the valtheron would be a final insult, a violation of the planet's natural order. Calla quickened her pace, her eyes scanning the trees for any movement. She had no idea what she would do when she found the predator, but she couldn't sit idly by. Not when there was a chance to stop the Othari from claiming yet another victory. The valtheron had retreated into a small clearing, where the canopy above allowed a rare shaft of light to filter through. Its breathing was ragged, and its once sharp movements were now sluggish and pained. It lay on its side, the energy net still wrapped around part of its hind leg, its fur matted with blood. Each breath seemed like a struggle, its chest heaving with the effort. It would die soon. The predator knew it. The Othari would find it, and there would be no escape this time. It had been the master of this world for longer than it could remember, but even the strongest beasts fell eventually. It growled low in its throat, not in defiance, but in resignation. The hunter had become the hunted. But as the valtheron lay there, something shifted in the air. It lifted its head, nostrils flaring, catching an unfamiliar scent. Not Othari, but something else. Something smaller. Its silver eyes gleamed as it tried to focus through the pain. And then it saw her Calla. The human emerged from the shadows of the trees, cautious but determined. She was small compared to the beast, barely reaching its shoulder, and yet there was no fear in her eyes. She knelt a few feet away, just out of reach of the valtheron's claws, and observed the creature with an intensity that made it uneasy. For a long moment, neither moved. The forest around them was silent, as if holding its breath. Finally, Calla spoke, her voice low and calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." The valtheron huffed, a sound that could have been amusement or disdain. It wasn't sure what to make of the human. The Othari were a threat it understood brute force and arrogance, but this small creature, what could she possibly want? Calla could see the skepticism in its eyes, and she slowly reached into her pack, pulling out a small device. It was something she had salvaged from a crashed Othari transport, a medical tool used for stabilizing wounded soldiers. She wasn't sure if it would work on the valtheron, but it was the best she had. "I can help," she said, taking a cautious step forward. "If you let me." The valtheron growled, its massive head lowering slightly, eyes narrowing. It could kill her in an instant, even in its weakened state. But something in the way she moved, careful, respectful, gave the predator pause. It had been hunted, attacked, and injured by the Othari, and yet this human was offering something different. Something it had never experienced before from any alien race. Trust. Calla knelt again, her hand shaking slightly as she activated the device. It hummed softly, emitting a warm light that pulsed in rhythm with the valtheron's heartbeat. The creature tensed but didn't attack. Slowly, Calla reached out and placed the device against the wounds, watching as the flesh began to knit itself back together, the bleeding slowing. She worked in silence for what felt like hours, her hands steady, her breath slow and even. The valtheron watched her the entire time, its silver eyes following her every movement. As the pain began to ease, the predator found itself relaxing, its breathing becoming less labored. When Calla finally finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted but satisfied. The device had done its job, at least partially. The valtheron was still injured, but it was no longer on the brink of death. It would need time to fully recover, but it had a chance now, a chance to live. The predator lifted its head and met Calla's gaze. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two beings from completely different worlds who had, in that instant, formed a fragile bond. Then the valtheron did something that surprised Calla. It rose to its feet, slowly and with some difficulty, and took a step toward her. She tensed, ready to flee if it showed any sign of aggression. But instead, it lowered its massive head until its snout was inches from her face. She could feel its warm breath against her skin. And then it nudged her gently with its nose. Calla blinked in surprise, her heart racing. The gesture was unmistakable, a sign of acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. Before she could react, however, a sound broke the quiet, a distant hum that grew louder with each passing second. The Othari were coming. The Othari soldiers moved through the forest with military precision, their weapons at the ready. They had tracked the valtheron's blood trail to this area, and they knew they were close. Their warlord, a particularly brutal officer named Calla, had promised a reward to the one who delivered the killing blow. That promise had ignited a fierce competition among the soldiers, each eager to claim the glory. But as they approached the clearing, something unexpected happened. The blood trail stopped. The Othari paused, scanning the area with their sensors, but there was no sign of the valtheron. Calla, a hulking figure clad in black armor, snarled in frustration. His beady eyes glared at the underbrush, convinced that the beast had to be hiding nearby. Spread out, he barked. Find it. The soldiers obeyed, fanning out into the trees. But they had no idea that Calla and the valtheron were already on the move. Calla had wasted no time when she heard the Othari's approach. She knew the predator was still too weak to fight them off, and she wasn't about to let them finish what they started. Without thinking, she had motioned for the valtheron to follow her, and to her surprise, it had. The two of them had slipped into the dense forest, moving as quickly as the injured creature could manage. The Othari were getting closer, though, and Calla knew they wouldn't be able to outrun them for long. They needed a plan. She led the valtheron to a narrow ravine, its steep walls offering some cover. The predator was panting heavily, its energy reserves nearly spent. It wouldn't survive another confrontation with the Othari in this state. Calla knelt beside it, her mind racing. She had to do something drastic. She glanced down at the small collection of explosives she had in her pack. They were crude, homemade devices she had cobbled together from scraps she found in the forest. They wouldn't be enough to kill the Othari outright, but they could create a diversion. "I'll draw them away," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if the valtheron understood her. "You stay here. Rest." The predator's silver eyes met hers, and for a moment Calla thought it might try to stop her. But instead it simply watched as she stood up, her determination hardening. She had been running and hiding from the Othari for 2 years, always avoiding direct confrontation. But not anymore. This time she was going to fight back. For the valtheron, for the planet, for herself. Calla sprinted through the forest, setting the explosives in key locations along the way. She knew the Othari would hear the detonations and come running. That was the plan. She needed to buy the valtheron as much time as possible. The first explosion rocked the trees, sending a shower of debris into the air. The second and third followed in quick succession, the forest echoing with the sound of destruction. The Othari soldiers reacted immediately, their disciplined movements turning chaotic as they scrambled to locate the source of the blasts. Kelrox roared in fury, his armor clanking as he charged toward the sounds. Calla watched from the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. It was working. The Othari were moving away from the ravine, giving the valtheron a chance to escape. But then, just as she thought she might succeed, something went wrong. One of the explosives she had planted malfunctioned, detonating too early and sending a wave of fire and shrapnel in every direction. Calla was caught in the blast, the force of it throwing her backward into the underbrush. Pain exploded in her side as she hit the ground, the wind knocked out of her. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. Her vision blurred, and she could feel the warmth of blood seeping from a wound on her arm. She wasn't sure how long she lay there, her mind slipping in and out of consciousness, but eventually she became aware of a presence nearby, something large and familiar. The valtheron. The predator had returned, its massive form looming over her. Its silver eyes glowed in the dim light, and for a moment Calla thought it might leave her there, a weak human who had tried to save a creature far more powerful than herself. But then the valtheron lowered its head and gently nudged her, just as it had before. Calla's breath hitched in her throat. Despite everything, despite the pain, despite the danger, she smiled. The predator didn't leave her behind. With a soft rumble that echoed in its chest, the valtheron crouched low, and to Calla's amazement, it nudged her onto its back. She clung weakly to its fur, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Together, they moved through the forest, away from the Othari, away from the devastation. The Othari would continue their hunt, but they would never find the valtheron. It had a new ally now, and the balance of the planet had shifted once again. Weeks later, the Othari hunting parties continued to search for the valtheron, but with no success. They didn't know that the predator had fully recovered, nor that it now roamed the forests with a human companion at its side. The Othari still saw themselves as the planet's conquerors, but they were wrong. Calla and the valtheron had become a part of the wild, a force the Othari would never understand, let alone defeat. And for the first time since their arrival, the planet felt hope. The Othari warlords grew restless. Weeks of searching, tracking, and deploying their finest hunters had led to nothing but frustration. Their advanced technology had failed them, no trace of the valtheron remained. Kelrox, who had once boasted of slaying the planet's apex predator, found his reputation tarnished. The creature, injured and weakened, should have been an easy target, and yet it had vanished as though it were nothing but a ghost in the wind. Little did they know, the valtheron had become something far more dangerous. It wasn't just a solitary beast anymore, it had a partner. A human underestimated and overlooked, but with more ingenuity and cunning than the Othari had ever imagined. Calla had become part of the planet's natural order, moving with the same stealth and grace as the wild creatures she had studied for years. And now, she and the valtheron were no longer on the defensive. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest where the valtheron once prowled alone. Now Calla stood beside it, the bond between them solidified. Her injuries had healed slowly with time, the predator staying close, keeping watch over her as she recovered. It had been more than just a survival instinct, there was something deeper in their connection now. Both had been hunted, both had suffered, and both had learned to rely on each other in ways neither could have predicted. The valtheron, once the planet's solitary apex predator, now operated with the coordination and strategy of a thinking partner. Calla had taught it how to use misdirection, how to lure the Othari into traps that weren't based on brute force, but on patience and precision. She showed it how to evade their sensors, how to use the environment to their advantage. It was as if the human mind and the predator's instincts had merged into one formidable force. Now, they weren't just running, they were hunting. In the heart of the Othari war camp, Kelrox paced angrily. His soldiers had returned from yet another failed search, their faces grim and nervous. Rumors had begun to spread among the ranks, rumors of something watching them from the shadows, something that moved too quickly to be seen and left no trace behind. Some of the lower-ranking soldiers whispered about the valtheron stalking them, biding its time. Kelrox snarled at the reports, but even he couldn't ignore the unease that had settled over his camp. Every time they ventured into the forest, fewer soldiers returned. And those who did spoke of sudden ambushes, traps laid in the undergrowth, and shadows that seemed to shift when they weren't looking. He couldn't afford to lose more men, and yet retreat was not an option. His pride wouldn't allow it. His honor as an Othari warlord demanded victory, and he was determined to get it. But tonight, everything would change. Calla and the valtheron watched from a high ridge, overlooking the Othari encampment. The predator crouched low beside her, its massive body blending into the twilight shadows. Calla's gaze was steady, calculating, as she surveyed the enemy below. "This is it," she murmured, her voice quiet but resolute. "We draw them out tonight." The valtheron rumbled in response, its silver eyes glowing faintly in the fading light. It understood her now in a way that was almost unsettling. There was no longer any hesitation in its movements, only purpose. Calla's plan was simple, yet effective. They would strike where the Othari were most vulnerable, targeting their supplies, their technology, and their communications. It wasn't about fighting them head-on, that would be suicide. Instead, they would unravel the warlord's command, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but confusion and fear. And the valtheron would be the one to deliver the final blow. With a nod to her companion, Calla descended into the forest, moving silently through the underbrush. The predator followed, its massive paws barely making a sound as they moved toward the camp. The Othari were heavily armed, but they had grown complacent, convinced that their enemy was either dead or fleeing. They had no idea the hunt was about to come for them. The first explosion tore through the camp just after midnight. Calla had rigged one of the fuel depots, timing it perfectly for when the soldiers were at their most vulnerable during the shift change between night guards. The blast lit up the sky, a brilliant flash that sent the Othari scrambling in confusion. Kelrox roared orders, trying to bring order to the chaos, but before he could, another explosion rocked the camp, this time, their communication hub. Sparks flew as equipment short-circuited, leaving them blind and deaf to the outside world. Panic spread like wildfire through the ranks as the soldiers realized their defenses were crumbling. And then, the valtheron struck. It moved like a shadow through the camp, silent and deadly. The Othari were trained soldiers, but they weren't prepared for an attack they couldn't see. One by one, they fell, their bodies dragged into the darkness before anyone could sound the alarm. Calla watched from the edge of the camp, picking off stragglers with a stolen Othari blaster. She was methodical, her shots precise, but she left most of the work to the valtheron. This was its battle, its revenge against the invaders who had scarred its world. The Othari soldiers, once so confident in their superiority, were now reduced to prey, running blindly through the trees in a desperate attempt to escape. But there was no escape. Kelrox, still barking orders at his fleeing troops, barely had time to react before the valtheron emerged from the shadows. It moved with lethal grace, its massive form a blur of black fur and flashing claws. The warlord raised his weapon, but it was too late. The predator lunged, its jaws closing around his arm, and with a single brutal twist, it ripped him apart. The warlord fell, his once imposing presence reduced to nothing more than a broken, bleeding corpse. The Othari's command structure collapsed with him, the soldiers scattering into the night, leaderless and terrified. Calla stood over the body of Kelrox, watching as the last of the Othari fled into the forest. She felt no pity for them. This was justice, long overdue. The valtheron padded over to her, its silver eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The predator had done what it was born to do. It had reclaimed its place as the apex of this world. Calla knelt beside the massive creature, resting a hand on its thick fur. They had won, but this wasn't the end. The Othari Empire was vast, and word would eventually spread of the defeat here. More soldiers would come, more ships, more warlords eager to prove themselves. But Calla wasn't afraid. She had the planet on her side now. She had the valtheron. And together, they would fight. In the weeks that followed, the Othari never returned. What remained of their forces on the planet either perished in the wilds or fled into space, their once mighty war effort reduced to ashes. Calla and the valtheron became legends among the scattered resistance forces on the planet. Stories spread of a human and a beast who had taken down an entire Othari war camp, who had turned the tide of the occupation. But Calla didn't care for glory. She cared for the planet and the fragile balance she had helped restore. The forest had healed, new life sprouting where the Othari had once burned and scarred the land. The valtheron, once a solitary predator, now moved through the forest with a quiet, watchful presence. It was still the apex predator, still feared and respected by every creature that shared the forest. But now it had something more. It had Calla. And together, they guarded the planet not as hunters or hunted, but as protectors. The balance had shifted, and the wild had reclaimed its own.